Hello, everybody. We are here today with the distinguished Johan Eddebo, whom this is the second time we've had the grace of his presence with us. And last time we discussed, generally we discussed the interesting points of contact between certain strains of Gnosticism and transhumanism. And we're not actually that far away from that wilderness in terms of our point of departure today, at least conceptually. Rather, though, we're going to take a different bit of a lead, and that lead is with the question of let's just go ahead and put it out there. The question of gender essentialism, and that actually connects to all kinds of things around what it is to know and so on and so forth. And we had a conversation with Michael Martin upon Excalibur and the chivalric reel, which maps onto this in a sense that that's some of where the question is the concept of the masculine necessary to ground us, give a sense of a narrative structure to our life. And does something like a chivalric code represent an explication of how to affect such an orientation? But of course, the predicate of that framing is that there is something about gender which is inextricable from human essence. But what is gender itself? Is it necessarily polar? Is it spectral? Let me just turn it over there to you on that point, since you've been wrestling with these questions of late.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tom. Yeah, so these are both immensely complex and hugely relevant topics for the contemporary period for various reasons, as everybody knows. But I recently, I've been thinking about the issue of sexual differences and what you and I perhaps would call the notion of immutably sexed aspects of embodied human experience. I mean, the notion that there's something unique and irreducible about being a man or a woman that kind of goes all the way down to the very core of our being in some sense, somehow. And a couple of weeks ago, I think, I read a post propounding the constructionist position, this anti-essentialist approach. And it struck me that this impossibility of constructionism stood clear to me, that I think because the very notion that what's probably arguably human universals are actually dependent on this successful and meticulous training of the human person, the young human person, and that they would actually fail to manifest if this training was absent. That struck me as so implausible, that we would actually need this successful and very detailed and very meticulous training for our gender differences to actually come to the surface. I think that's a hard idea, a tough idea to swallow. So what do you think about this notion, the tabula rasa perspective, and the idea that we're these empty vessels just ready to be filled with basically whatever set of behavioral patterns the society can come up with? How do you approach this suggestion?
Well, as you note, it's a hard pill to swallow. I think that it would require assuming a tact of extreme skepticism regarding the suggestion of one's immediate or naive, if you like, experience. It's even tempting. It would be even tempting for me, though I try to stay away from arguments that have kind of a naturalistic bent to them, to look at the animal and the the flora and the fauna, the kingdom plants and animals and nature in general, and the manner in which sex just shows up everywhere as part of natural process. And given that even the most cursory survey of that world, which we would call alive, exhibits sexual difference as fundamental to its process along so many lines. The idea that it is merely the function of some kind of aggressive conditioning starts to strike me as implausible, right? I mean, of course, then what I've done is I've entered into the exchange, the predicate that our biology, that our physical body, our embodiment is both a connection, a node of contact with this world of light, this world of nature, and also has a very intimate relationship with who and what we are as individuals.
Right.
So, I mean, it might then the point, I suppose, the constructionist if I was going to try and save the constructionist position, I suppose I would have to say what is necessary to do, and I'm spitballing here, is to look at the case of the individual as opposed to the body. They will say, what I'm doing is I'm using the body as a tact, as a sort of a plate of inscription upon which I'm now etching a set of values, including a certain reading of nature, they may say. They may say that my suggestion that the sexual processes of flowers or bees or rhinoceroses are not actually sexual in the human sense, that I don't actually have access to the lives of these other entities. And so it is unwarranted to lean so far as I am on the analogy which I suggested. And then in turn, you take the notion of the radically the individual as decentered from the question of the human being. Human being then is not fundamentally a social entity. It is the individual isn't even necessarily human, right? Okay, so then even the idea of you have is a subjectivity, a raw subjectivity, not yet compromised. That's perhaps too polemical for me to use the word compromise there, but not yet molded in a fashion to make it ineradicably something specific, even as a specific member of a specific genus or species or what have you, right? In fact, the raw subjectivity can, in principle, be coordinated with any kind of entity. You could enter into being a bat or enter into, Thomas Nagel always comes up, whatever. Or, you could enter in being a human being. It's kind of weird because as far as you try and put things abstractly, you still feel like I'm being drawn into a trope or a structure of language, which is almost implicitly mythological, because as you get down to the formal level, all of a sudden it sounds like I've almost transposed myself into a kind of Buddhistic account of the birth of the subject. That's not what, by the way, I'm attempting to do or claiming. It's just that there's an impressionistic resonance there. So to try and get back to the root point of radical constructionism, the suggestion that our identity is and our tendency to behave in a distinctive fashion after the manner of a sex or a gender, and it might be useful to elucidate the relationship between those terms, which I must confess is not, I think, as straightforward as it's supposed to be, the elucidation of that difference. But where it comes down to is the very notion of the tabula rasa itself is problematic. So that's a question which arises even before you get to the question of gender. All of a sudden, we arrived at an interrogation of modernity's account of the human subject, which may in fact have buried within it the seeds of this confusion.
Yes.
But that's even before we get to this opacity of the present moment, right? So I've gone on for a bit here. Maybe I'd like to turn it back over to you, and is this like a useful response on my part?
Oh yeah. This is great. This is very good. I agree with all the points you're making. I can continue if you didn't have anything to add just now.
Well, the only thing I want to add is that I want this, and I believe we want this conversation not to be simply some kind of sophomoric critique of the those who have assumed some positive position vis-a-vis transgenderism, right? Or those who communicate that they are transgender, because their humanity is still obviously manifest, right? This is not, I'm not in any way refuting their personhood or anything like that. I want to be absolutely clear. All right. And really maybe the interrogation of the category of personhood might be useful down the line here. But there are tensions around these matters that merit exploration. So I guess if there's anything I would add, it's that, I want to make that crystal clear that we're just trying to attain a clarity as far as is possible in this domain. And then in the background of this effort, the fundamental imperative is, this is me speaking, and I imagine you would feel very similarly, is an imperative of kindness. Okay. We want to be kind. That is absolutely fundamental. So I do not want anybody to misconstrue why we're having this discussion.
Right.
There you go. So.
Great. I completely agree with you. And I think I could just add as a parenthesis that the manifestation of transgenderism as an experience is in itself, I think, a form of critique of the modern representation of the subject, the Cartesian and monolithic representation of the human subject. But we can perhaps get back to that in a while, because I think these are very, very interesting remarks you give us here, because in this notion of constructionism, already here there's a clear tendency towards what you could perhaps call Gnosticism, but clearly also the Cartesian cut. There's a sort of projection of the ideal objectivity of Enlightenment anthropology, this detached subject, this detached observer that's not enmeshed in corporeal relational reality. And I think that's an interesting observation you make. I think you also added that an extreme skepticism of innate experience is needed if we're going to make sense of or mount a tabula rasa perspective. So givenness, I haven't thought about this, but givenness in the subjective and phenomenal sense must almost be completely denied, because as soon as you have embodied givenness, there is something that's essentialistic in a sense. There's something that's metaphysically essentialistic, if I can phrase it like that. And to make sense of the tabula rasa perspective, you must say that there's nothing immediately given in our sexed and embodied human experience and becoming, which must deny down the line the connection between our subjective experience and embodied selves, the connection between us as persons and the tangible physical reality around us, which we are rooted in and which we are part of. but that being said, of course, there's an aspect of socialization into gender roles. I mean, the gender as a social construction is by definition and by empirical verification a sociological reality. You know, it's real, but I think it's obvious that this is kind of the secondary and contingent aspect of the issue. I mean, there are social institutions such as gender roles, and they have an impact on how we behave and even how we experience the world and think of ourselves as human beings. And they can shape and mold our perspectives and our phenomenal reality, but I don't think they can displace these more fundamental aspects of our sex-embodied human nature, which I think comes out in some way no matter how we cut it. And I would argue that we can only coherently understand these fundamental aspects of the sex-embodied human person on essentialist terms, on something very much like the way classical metaphysics, classical philosophy in both the East and the West considers it. Would you like to add something here? I mean, do you think there's possible?
Well, I guess what
Yeah.
I would add on the question of the reality of gender as being broadly a social construction, is that while that fact of its constructed nature also shows an enormous capacity of variance, right? That there is not just one way in which to couch the matter, right? There's a wide array of possibilities in terms of how gender becomes configured. Yet that variance, that range, to me, cannot be understood as completely untrammeled. It's not a blank check. And I think the reason that it's not a blank check is because it arises as a response to certain primordial aspects of our being, right? The other thing that perhaps merits attention here is that gender role does rise in connection with our fundamental sociality.
Right.
Right. To have any gender role is to make a statement about where you are going to relate to the other members in the matrix in which you find yourself, the social matrix, right? A gender role to me is definitionally, and maybe I can be challenged on this point, but even the negation of a gender role and assertion of just asexuality, which some people take that stance, is a statement of social orientation. And so where does this lead us? This leads us back to, and I'm kind of talking this through as we're talking. So may I be forgiven if at times it seems like I'm rambling a bit, but where this comes back to is that gender, while having a great flexibility, a kind of plasticity to it or gender roles, nonetheless is yet bounded. It's bounded by the fact that social realities, social relationships themselves have characteristic finitudes about them. There's a definite way in which you're going to relate with this other definite person or whatnot. And also, it's a reflection of aspects of that sociality which are rooted in biological imperatives. Okay, and this is kind of a sticky wicket here, right? But at the end of the day, males and females are drawn to interact with each other. I can make this statement in a species neutral way, right? You can talk about male and female, frogs, okay? Okay, they're drawn to interact with each other to facilitate the production, the reproduction, the giving birth to other frogs. And the members of the other frogs, by the way, have implications for frog society. Okay. All right. So it's a question of life. It's a question of life and how we are involved in that process. I'm using this word production, and I'm like making my own skin crawl because I hate that word production, because it economizes things implicitly, and it should not be reduced to economic terms, however powerfully the economic looms as a ramifying vector in this conversation. So those are my thoughts there.
Sure. And let me, if I can just paraphrase you here a bit. I guess what you're saying is that as soon as you open this Pandora's box of essentialism, even something like gender roles on even a minimal essentialist assumption does not take place in a vacuum, because the gender roles, constructed as they may be, must then inevitably relate to a tangible reality that's somehow delineated on essentialist terms. So even if
it certainly seems that way to me. I mean, perhaps
I agree. That's a reasonable. I think that follows from the very notion of essentialism. So as you say, the socially constructed gender roles might give culturally some leeway on how human beings can manifest our personhood, but this is not something unbounded, and it must resonate with the other agents as well as whatever immutable essential characteristics we have in the equation. And I think that's a good point, because it seems to me an inevitable conclusion as soon as you factor in some sort of immutable essentialism, right? But would you like to add something here?
No, I just am always, I feel like I feel it is incumbent upon me to concede in this, because I wish I had someone else in this conversation who, I would just have to find a transgender interlocutor, right? So that I can have I'm sorry I don't have a representative at hand, right? So
preferably a constructionist of the constructionist persuasion, right?
Because I want to be as fair, I want to be utterly fair, right? Because it just,
if you're are you familiar with John Michael Greer? He's the author of the Archdruid Report. He was he's some sort of US.
I'm sorry.
Come again?
No, I can't say that I'm familiar.
All right. But he represents what I would broadly construe as New Age, neo-Druid philosophy and metaphysics, and his outlook is essentialist, but it gives this clear conceptual space for specifically a transgender understanding of the self, because he speaks of the human being, the human person existing in layers of non-material forms, so to speak. So there's a primary sexed layer, then there's a secondary sexed layer, which is opposite, and these can interact, and these can be transposed and become their opposites, and that's these kinds of. So there is conceptual space for transgenderism even on essentialist positions, I would say, but probably not on my own Catholic outlook,
Right. Now you did say, to go back to a parenthetical remark, how in some respects you see transgenderisms or certain transgender discourses as themselves a form of critique the aspects of modernity. Could you spell that out a bit more?
I've got to think about it, but really the mere destabilizing the notion that we can disconnect the self from our material, the surroundings and their, it might sound, it's sort of if you take the Cartesian cut to its extreme, like all the way to the end, there's sort of an implicit critique of monolithic modernity here, sort of like how the disembodiment of Cartesianism finally even implies the liberation from the conceptual frameworks that sort of enmeshing us in modernity, but I have to think about that before I can say something halfway reasonable, you know. But if we go back to the classical conception of the human person, you know, such as represented by Platonism or Aristotelianism, and I think you see it even in East Asian philosophy. Here, there's absolutely no Cartesian cut between the body and the mind. There's this notion is entirely alien because the subjective and the quantifiable realm is sort of one, all integrated in this harmonious sense. And you see this perspective throughout classical philosophy, I think, all across the world. You see it in Aboriginal Australia and in African wisdom traditions. And on these positions, there's something about the very depth of my embodied being that is male, which means that I, as a male human being, will respond to the world in a certain sense, that I will have certain predilections, capacities for experience. And importantly also, it means that you and I will have a unique set of potentialities for growth and for harmonious relationship with the world and with other human beings that also need to be stewarded properly. They need to be harnessed properly to actually come to fruition. And this, I think, is lost to the perspective of modern society. And in some sense, I think that the transgender discourse is trying to recover something of this. I'm not sure how, but I think that's an argument in support of it being destabilizing of modernity.
So to try and recapitulate what you're suggesting, there's something in terms of how we know the world, that is itself a function of, and I mean, it's on a very basic, like on an ontic level. There is a relationship and an embodied level, very basic, very primordial, between how the world discloses itself to our being and our being. So it's sexed from the outset. And so a maleness or a masculine, or well, not masculine, but a male subjectivity invites a different disclosure from the world than female subjectivity, right?
Sure.
So
that would be the classical position.
The classical position will tend to, I don't know, some might be, it will be suggested that this perspective has a tendency, when I stated it like I just stated it, I think it's more or less neutral, all things equal, but the suggestion will nevertheless be forthcoming that this suggestion implicitly is prejudiced in favor of the male, or that it derives from a tradition which is incapable or very limited in its appreciation of the woman as a space in which being, the clearing of the woman allows for being to disclose itself in a different way, but the language of the inherited discourse around gender before it's even gender is so sort of compromised by patriarchal disposition that it is being unfair to women in a way that perhaps can ground an utter refutation of that attack. I'm just trying to be very careful. So, I mean, how do you respond to that? That the objection that this classical framing is chauvinistic by nature. How do you respond to that objection?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that it's sort of chauvinistic by nature, but I think I would concede that it has been made manifest in this way, arguably in lots of different contexts. And I would also probably add some form of anarcho-primitivist critique of civilization and put a lot of that up on authoritarian civilizations account, so that what's approached as patriarchy is really, to a great extent, a sort of way of distributing power in complex civilizational hierarchies. So I think I could say that the essentialist classical perspective is true, but it's been made manifest in a negative sense many times. And I think the objective gaze of Cartesian modernity is in some sense a sort of warped mirroring, a sort of warped manifestation of an impoverished masculine outlook. And that is why in some way transgenderism tries to correct and recover this. It sort of destabilizes this entrenched and distorted masculinity inherent in Cartesian modernity. So I think that's a
So
that's a
when
point
you
we can
say
make.
that, what is the path being taken there, putatively? Is it
From
that
by whom?
is it that the individual, by more assertively structuring their identity, is trying to cut themselves off from the implicit oppressiveness of, or it's not so implicit, the oppressiveness of imperial structures, right?
Yeah.
They're saying that, but it's so, I mean, all right. So I guess so then, of course, I have some questions personally as to the viability of that subversiveness, but I appreciate the tact. And as a person also pretty wedded to existentialism, and even existentialism of more or less Sartrean bent, with some qualifications. Actually, I want to give freedom as much ambit as possible, right? But an interesting counterpoint to Sartre is Gabriel Marcel, who can also be brought to bear in this connection, because what Marcel suggests is that freedom can only be effectively realized in relationship.
Right.
Radically free individual. So can only be radically free when they enter into particular kinds of relationships with other beings.
Yeah.
So you could see then how the attack of the transgender movement has some of these intuitions at its heart.
Yeah, I agree. That's perfect.
Then the apprehension just becomes then one of the weight we want to give to our inherited body, and that's just it's a difficult question.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's difficult because it's so connected with the questions of life and the future, and it's really a civilizational question.
Right.
But it also connects us to the question of life, and not in the Illichian sense, right? Where Ivan Illich was concerned that life had become a new idol. Life is a resource.
Right. No, yeah.
But not that sense of life, but life is this
not in the sense of biopolitics, but in this
Right.
in some sort of
Or in a more immediate
holistic sense.
a
Yeah.
more immediate holistic sense, and how what I'm basically doing is I'm saying we have to come back to our naive and immediate experience. Lots of these
I
things
completely
have come along as barnacles. Barnacle, sorry, I know that's a pejorative word. I apologize to my notional interlocutor who does not share my critique for that pejorative. But these civilization has created a very, let us say, congested situation, intellectually and otherwise, spiritually even, and that congestion has produced a kind of density that makes these sorts of matters sort of difficult to spell out without inadvertently being offensive along the way. I'm going to turn it over to you for a second here.
I'm just gonna fill in, because I think I agree with you completely, and I intuit the fruitful intentions of the implicit critique in the transgender discourse. But as you say, I think the mode of subversion is destructive in the long run, because what it is predicated upon, which I think is the loss of the essentialism and the ontologically real relationships, and which I think hold in reality, and which I think the acknowledgement of which are essential, necessary for us to be fully human in a concrete sense. Exactly what that means or what that portends, I'm not sure. But and as you say, I would also argue that the contemporary secular worldview, at a deeper structural level, not only in these contemporary social movements, but at a more profound level, tends to reject and deny these fundamental realities of human natures. And I think it's so obvious in Cartesianism, where you sever the subjective reality from the objectified and reducible material body and material universe around us, and which also regards the latter, the material embodied universe, as devoid of meaning and the innate intentionalities, the telos, the form of Aristotelianism. And this bifurcation is key to the transgender movement, and it's also what holds up its connections to Gnosticism, where the body is considered more or less an arbitrary manifestation of random forces with no real connection to the enduring human consciousness or soul. So only the surface is acknowledged, and which is the quantifiable, sanitized, and sort of depersonalized aspects of reality, of our bodies, of our physical relational existence. But I don't think one should fault the proponents of the gender discourse and so on for this, because I think they're being true to the dominant metaphysical narratives of our age, the dominant metaphysical narratives of modern industrial society. I mean, I think they're basically just drawing the inevitable conclusions of the worldview around us,
Yeah, the fault lies elsewhere. Whatever, there it is. And this may come back to the issue of the tabula rasa, right? Or the account of our relationship with how we know the world that is implicit in modernity, right? There it's very much a question of what can be discretely quantified and subject to manipulation. Well, there is a circumstance that this is an epistemology that can only be handled by a truncated metaphysics. Okay.
Yeah.
If the metaphysical is the effort to construe what is at the root of nature, then you are immediately confronted by the reality that nature exhibits a continuity, a continuousness, which is ultimately irreducible to what the tools of quantification can accommodate. Now, this is going to sound incredibly, I know how it sounds. It sounds like incredibly technical and academic and perhaps even mildly pedantic, but it's actually a big deal. It's actually a big deal, the distinction between the analog and the digital. And what we're doing, I think, broadly speaking, is we're limiting our metaphysical horizon to accompany our commitment to a mathematical epistemology, or not even a mathematical epistemology, because that's actually beneath the dignity of mathematics, right? But a technicized epistemology to accommodate an aspiration for dominance. And the result is a diminishing of our relationship with the world. That's sort of me putting my cards on the table. The world is bigger than what you can count, right? It's interesting because even if you look at the mechanics of things like programming and so forth, right? And even calculus, what is calculus? Calculus is, in a sense, an effort to mechanically move past the problem of discontinuity. That's and so you just in the heart of the calculus, as I understand it, which of course is subject to improvement and correction. There's an act of faith. There's a jump. There's a jump at the limit, where all of a sudden, all the discrete differentials sort of resolve almost magically into the solution.
But that's just to parenthesize here. What you're saying is also what you're describing is a key problem in the philosophy of science, and Paul Feyerabend, he phrased it like that: the model always being an incomplete approximation of the reality it purports to represent. So while reality is potentially infinite, the model is finite. So it's always going to be inexact and incomplete. And moreover, the model or the theory lives sort of its own life detached from the reality it represents. So over time, it will become less and less faithful to the reality it's supposed to depict, which is why we have these paradigm shifts in science, for instance, because there's a junction, there's this disjointedness which we need to address by sort of scrapping the old models and then getting back to reality again and again. I think that it's the same issue we're talking about.
Yeah, but the other wrinkle is that human beings have a degree of indeterminacy about them, right? So we begin to be subject to the influence of these models. This shows up, and this is why this becomes a crucial issue, because our sense of what is being human is being diminished. In fact, I would say there is actually a violence being done to the human, which then shows up in even discourses around so-called machine intelligence. And then
absolutely.
It's not benign. It is not benign, in my view, which some will receive as radical and Luddite. It is not benign to be deeply engaged with something like ChatGPT.
Right.
To me, it actually deforms your own mentality to be having a fundamentally false conversation, because a real conversation is something you're having with another subjectivity. Subjectivity, right? And it's also infecting the way that you use your own speech.
Right. Yeah.
And this is just ChatGPT is just one example. The use of these technologies is legion, and they are biblical pun not intended, but nevertheless gratefully accepted, right? The use of these technologies are legion, and they they're interfering with our ability to have a relationship with each other.
Oh, I completely agree, and I think this cannot really be overstated. And I think I mean, I've been conscious of these problems for quite some time, but I recently come to understand at least a bit more of the depth of the damage they can cause, because just as you're saying, we're creating these relational attachments to things that are not human, which then actually, so if the essentialist notion of sort of extended identity and relational identity holds water, this means that your interaction with this machine tends to make you become, in a very tangible and literal sense, more machine-like yourself. I mean, you change in relation to that which you interact with. So that's not as much of a metaphysical issue on Cartesianism, because you're detached. But on the holistic, embodied, and relational conception of the human self, it's actually much more dangerous to deeply interact with these non-human or anti-human structures. And this segues somewhat into the main problem I tried to sketch with my text. I think you read it, where I talked about these issues of embodied sexual selves at length. And my point was here that if this sort of locks human beings out of certain aspects of embodied human experience, if it sort of deprives us of experiences and relations and modes of being that are essential for us to fully become human, well, that compounds at the societal level. It deprives us of something like these generational structures, where you have had people interacting with these deeper aspects of lived human experience for their entire lives, and then bringing this experience to fruition and then trading it on to subsequent generations. You sort of lose a whole ecosystem of experiential resonance, so that something like traditional wisdom becomes impossible in a sense. And can you connect these disjointed remarks to your thoughts, perhaps?
Well, I just think that they were just an extension. It's starting to concretize my sort of generally expressed position, right? I mean, it is a generational question, right? Because you have to acknowledge that those people who are younger have a far more pronounced exposure. You know, I had this anecdotal, it's fascinating personal experience where I am. So I hike, I'm 46 at this time of this recording, and then I see people in their 30s and their 20s and so forth. And there's, what's fascinating is how you pick up on these. And I actually don't like the idea of making hard differences amongst generations, right? But it's sort of, which itself, I think, might be a function of our contemporary circumstance, that the discourse is suggesting a sort of discrete approach to generations, which is sort of historically unique. Because historically, by the way, generations were not so markedly segregated as they are at this time. But their relationship with technology is different. But I ran into this friend of mine who's 23, and he's only 23, but he was expressing despair at what it's like for him to interact with 19-year-olds. Okay, he's like, I see a big difference with 19-year-olds, right? So it's like you're looking at a 4-year bracket And it's like, what is going on? It's like
Yeah.
where I'm looking at 30 or a 10-year difference, and he looking at a 4-year difference. And it's like not it's and all of it connects to the relative exposure to technology. Now,
Right. Yeah.
I do, not to be altogether gloomy about it, I do happily also encounter people across all generational spectrums who are concerned and who are resisting this tendency. So the sun also rises, as it were, right? But where am I going with all this? Back to that. So I guess what it comes down to is the importance of epistemology, which is some people, well, that's too technical of a word to be that important. But how we think we know the world has a relationship to how we are going to be in the world. And it will perhaps be salutary to recall that the sense of knowing, which was propounded by Descartes, and not just Descartes, but prior to him, Bacon and Machiavelli even, is a dark, cynical perspective, right? I mean, there's some really terrifying passages in Bacon, for example, where he talks about putting nature on a rack, torture nature. These metaphors are not innocent. They're not innocent, in my view. They actually suggest that there is an effort to relate with the world in a particular way that is incongruent with wisdom, Or to be sort of Tolkien-esque, I could say to break a thing, to understand it, is to depart from the path of wisdom. But where we find ourselves is in a place where so many things have to be broken in order to found the new Atlantis in which we're, which this world is wanting to construct.
I'm not sure I have something specific to add to these remarks because it's such a huge and complex topic, but that's probably the essence of modern epistemology. I mean, the modern sense of knowing that's deeply entrenched in the contemporary scientific worldview. And I'm scrambling here to see a connection to the notion of expert authority and this discourse of fact checking and the commingling, the suppression of actual reason and its substitution by authority. And I guess those metaphors you describe imply that there's an exchange of power. There's a one-sided exchange of power, which this mode of knowing is predicated upon. So there's a form of violence that precedes this kind of knowing, and this kind of mirrors, I think, this confusion of authority and knowledge, which we see now in sort of full fruition around us. Or do you see a connection here, or am I just associating freely?
The connections are, so we get to the problem of professionalism. That is, we're so far in this conversation, we've been dealing with sort of the very fundamental, very primordial realities at the ground of these controversies, right? And I would say that the problem of professionalism arises a few more steps up the ladder. It's not absolutely connected. If I was going to find the connecting theme, it's a term of power, and knowledge becomes weaponized.
Right.
So, right. The thing is that the desire to dominate nature will also translate into the desire to dominate other people.
Right.
And this manifests in very concrete terms. It manifests in the kind of politics that you want to forward, a la Machiavelli, who ironically argues for a republic, but in a way which is based in a cynicism that is ultimately, as far as from where I stand personally, anti-democratic. And here I'm talking about an anarchistic account of democracy, not these derivative representative democracies, which are ersatz. But when you come to professionalism, the use of different knowledges really just becomes a pretext for controlling people. I mean, medicine, right? The premier example, the notion that the subject does not have authority to determine their own health is fundamental to the operation of current hierarchy.
Yeah, I agree.
And if you look at contemporary medical discourse, there is a point of connection between the biopolitical and the digital, right? And the quantitative. There is an account of life, and now we're back at the notion of life, which is you know, in the crosshairs of Ivan Illich, the life as resource, what can be contained, and then what happens is the individual is no longer a person; they're just a vessel of this resource to be managed in order to replicate, expand this resource, and even the miracle of a new human life or a new life, any life is lost in its aspect as a miracle. It just becomes an occasion for replication, extension, reproduction of the machine.
Right.
I feel like I'm talking a lot. It's great. So like when you come to the problems of professionalism, so-called expert authority, I think in those structures, the individuals are perhaps unwittingly, they've become agents of a way of understanding the world, which is almost necessarily oppressive.
Right.
It's all rooted on the presumption of hostility. It's rooted on the presumption that the nature is hostile and scarce and something with which one has to wrestle, right? And on the basis of this, from this root hostility, all these other things can sort of be adduced.
Absolutely so. And in some sense, the very notion of this expert set apart from the rest with his or her occult and specialized knowledge that none of the rest of us have access to, it kind of mirrors the Cartesian separation in the sense that we're no longer nodes in a relational reality whose perspectives all sort of contribute to the being of the whole, but we have these distinct, separate, and wholly detached parts. And I'm not sure if it's true, but or at least I'm not sure how helpful it is, but at least from my own personal experience, the recovery of a relational ontology of the self and a relational epistemology has been very helpful to me to reconfigure my perspective on the world and how I relate to it and my own identity in relation to all of these issues. And I think it can be a the recovery of these holistic identities and modes of knowing can be a useful tool in countering these processes, but I'm not exactly sure how effective they can be, or in what way they must be or should be implemented.
Well, I mean, I think it kind of depends on one's own style of thinking, right? Philosophy is supposed to be fundamentally therapeutic, a la
Right.
Boethius, right? And therapies themselves cannot be algorithmically derived,
No.
right? The therapy arises out of a relationship in which the authentic nature of those two individuals in that relationship can help can discern how a healing can unfold, right? So, but there are different languages, different ways of talking about things that can be more or less helpful to different individuals, right? The emphasis, though, on the relational may be especially salutary as an antidote to the atomistic tendencies du jour. Now, perhaps the wicket, the aporia, the crux, the crucial problem is to avoid the void, to avoid the temptations of nihilism, right? So if you remove the individual as sort of a ground, the person, like we can say, we have to re-understand what we mean by the person, because if you remove the person as the ground from which our account of truth derives, then you are in this open space. It's an indeterminate. I was just looking for another word, this indeterminacy. I almost said this indeterminate sphere, but then the notion sphere itself sort of suggests a structure. But that can be vertiginous, and conduce to nihilistic tendencies. So when you talk about, well, we're just going to go ahead and make our ontology relational, you've removed kind of an anchor point, because the relationship is not reducible to a monolith, a monad, right? There are two beings. There's difference, the difference, right? Okay, and an interactivity there, and so insofar as it's coherent and enduring, it's coherent and enduring in a dynamic way, and that dynamism is kind of it can be thrilling, but it can also be frightening because it requires a kind of faith in the process. It's a problem of faith, right? Because if you have the individual as this this unmovable object upon which to wield your Archimedes Archimedean lever, then you don't need faith anymore, right? And faith, or conversely, the fetish of certitude, in a way, is the problem of the moment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there's a lot of things to think about here. First of all, I would probably say that we don't have to go so far as to remove the person as an anchoring point, even if we open ourselves up to a more relational mode of philosophical anthropology, let's say. I think there's no necessary conflict between the two perspectives, and I think they can be meaningfully integrated. So we don't have to go all the way into the non-self ontologies you sometimes philosophy, I think, in East Asian philosophies and so on. So I think we can combine the notion of I think we really need to make sense of the world, need to combine the notion of embodied subjective experience with the difference you emphasize with the relational embodied modes of being. So that's a whole deep topic of discussion. But I also would like to remark that the Cartesian detachment, it's not primary. It's a theory, and it depends on formal intellection, and it's always secondary to immediate embodied experience. It's an abstract theory that's dependent on certain theoretical preconditions. And I would argue that the combination of relational embodied experience and the pertinent node, which implies a difference, these are more fundamental because both are available immediately to the subject. We can also, just as a parenthesis, perhaps recall that if you look at what people in severe mental distress fear or experience, the modes, the qualitative modes of psychosis, you can say, in our day and age it's these things as you think you're living in the matrix, you don't think you're real, you think perhaps you are dead, these kinds of things which sort of are the acute and extreme manifestation of a Cartesianism in a sense. And if you compare this to the modes of psychosis of earlier eras, we have a whole different set of experiences. And I think these deep existential fears of certain sensitive individuals exhibit and make manifest the contradictions, the deep contradictions in our worldview that probably need to be addressed for the society as a whole to function and move forward. Yeah, there's a lot to think about here.
It's a lot. It's a good deal of work.
Yeah.
Not just intellectually. It's
an
incredible sort of psychical. There's a spiritual dimension to what needs to happen. I'm using the word spiritual really for want of a better word, right? Because the shifts that seem to be related to movement beyond this impasse involve terrains beyond the purview of language, at least language discursively intended. You can maybe arrive there through poetry or music or silence, but you are not going to be able to
reason your way there.
Yeah, you can't reason your way there. And the other thing is, so like from where I derive hope is actually just human reality and human relationship, because good things happen all the time, all over the place in institutions, and they happen despite institutions. Good things happen in institutions despite the institutions, because people, and it may sound really corny, but people are still people, and they still actually want to care for each other and love each other. And this is an expression of an irreducible essence, right? And that is from what I derive my hope in this period, which I think is arguably a rather gloomy period. I think in some ways very comparable to the early 20th century, when you were, I don't know what it would have been like to have been alive in 1943, but I don't think it was a cheery affair. Okay.
No, right.
Right. Okay. Or immediately in the wake of such a cataclysm as as the Second World War. Now, this is a different junction, and there are different things at hand, but psychically, I think we're in the vicinity of, or spiritually or culturally, I think we're in the vicinity of an analogous intensity of
Yes.
stress.
Oh yes. Oh yeah, I totally agree. And I think I think this kind of boils down to what you said earlier regarding our enmeshment in the machine, our deeply entrenched relational attachments to technology and what I would call the spectacle, the mass media, the digitalized sort of pseudo reality we're living in. And I
It's
think this narrows our being, and this narrows our basic phenomenality in this sense, which brings about these acute existential fears and disconnections, which are manifest in these ways I discussed. And I think there's generally there's maybe no way to reason yourself out of this, except you can maybe get a certain part of the way there, but what's needed are these genuine immediate relational connections to the world and human beings around us. And in that experience, I think, talking from my own personal experience, I think it's we can see immediately that other ways of being, other ways of interaction with the world and with others are possible. That this I talk about it as distributed relational experience can actually take place. And if you have that part, then it's perhaps possible to move forward into a more integrated human mode of being. Sorry, it's a doorbell.
yes, yes. Sometimes I think a bit about the sort of I've never actually read the short story or seen the film, but people have told me about this from Philip K. Dick, the Man in the High Castle, and in terms of like how people arrive at realizing that other worlds, better worlds are possible, right? There's this underground of people circulating video cassettes of old movies, sometimes just home movies, and it shows things which seem almost impossible to the dystopia, which is the story's point of departure, but which in fact is just quotidian at the moment of those films being captured, right? And I think there's some hope in a similar way at this time where there's still people who remember a world from, I don't know, 1986, I don't know, okay, where things have not yet quite gotten to where
Yeah.
they are now, right? So I think history can have a constructive role to play here in addition to that, which is just sort of a coda and an appendix to that, right? It does seem like something has happened. I don't know. It's hard to say, right? I think that the past 3 years, 3.5 years were atrocious in a fashion which exceeds our ability to exaggerate. I don't think we can even understand what's happened. And this is sort of falling away a little bit from what we've been discussing formally, but I'm just going to say that to me, one of the most bizarre things is the kind of indifference with which many people claim to feel about the last year. Indifference may not be the best word, but it's like, well, that's what it was. I'm just going to go on with it, right? Now, yes, it's true. You don't want to cry over spilt milk, and certainly I'm glad to be past the worst of that nonsense, right? But still, how can you not be astonished? How can one not be astonished at the extent of confinement and imposition which transpired? And how can you not recover the sense that you might have that would not have been possible in 1986 or 1970 or 1969, which 1969, the Asian flu was rampant.
But I think it also numbs you. I mean,
Right.
While it diminishes you, it also numbs you. And I probably the last 10 years of predominant nostalgia in popular culture has something to do with the lack of connection in the contemporary situation. I just wanted to add maybe that
Yes.
if we don't have a Cartesian conceptualization of this stuff, if we have an idea of the self it's a composite object, as us Aristotelians would phrase it, that it's a thing consisting of a lot of parts, so that you can add parts to it and you can remove parts from it. Then it follows that your embodied first person perspective experience of being it can be added to by relational connections. So that if you add a few relational connections, your experience can be qualitatively different. This is impossible from the Cartesian perspective. And contrary-wise, if you remove relations from it, you will diminish the experience, you will become less human, you will become numb and less sensitive to certain experiences, which will be excluded from your point of view. I think that's an interesting model, at least, to think about these things through. Also, it's completely unrelated to this, but maybe not. I'm curious to your previous discussion on the connection between chivalry and maleness, but maybe I should just listen to that podcast instead.
It was a rather informal affair, but there were, I shouldn't say it was that informal. We used the film Excalibur as just kind of a point of departure, the 1981 John Borman film. And we're just interrogating the possibility that through something like that code, you had a sense of place and responsibility. And it was with Michael Martin. And one of the main themes in that conversation, well, there are two things. Well, one thing that was sort of resonant between this conversation and that conversation is my emphasis on the need to revisit a sense of trusting your own experience, trusting what is apparent, okay, without becoming lost in abstractions, which become sort of torturous and lead to, I think, less than fruitful ways of framing yourself. But then also the question of wildness. And so he was suggestive that there's something about being male that has a kind of violence, the masculinity has a kind of violence built into it. To be honest, I struggle with that. I kind of inclined to resist that hypothesis on one level, okay? But I see from where he's coming, and we talk about that. And the notion is that that sort of energy can be channeled and I won't use the word sublimated because we don't want to necessarily land in the highly Freudian context, but it was more just a set of musings. I wouldn't say that we arrived at a particular conclusion. A lot of the back and forth was implicit, like we talked about hunting, for example. And I don't personally approve of it. We had a little bit of back and forth about it. Like it was all utterly collegial. But as far as, its point of contact with this conversation, I might be tempted, and this is really me just sort of thinking about it, right? I might be tempted to say, what is the kind of world in which we actually live? And if you watch a film like Excalibur, which was just sort of incidental, these people live in a different world. And that's not to say that that world is unreal. It's not entirely clear to me what is real. So to me, what is real? Well, actually, I have my opinions, as it were. Right? So for me, I take very seriously the suggestion, as I've said in other places, that the angelic and the demonic are meaningful categories. that we are not the only game in town. All right. I think that mythological discourse has ontological weight. And our discounting of that ontological weight has put us in a scenario of perilous liability. And this sort of came up in a conversation I had with Babbage just yesterday, actually. I think it was just yesterday. It was the day before yesterday. I think about Gunther Anders and his critique of nuclear weaponry was the chief focus. But one thing that comes up in the conversation is, along the greatest trick the devil ever pulled is convincing the world didn't exist, right? So what is, I think, valuable about reinvestigating these things, like the category of the masculine or the feminine, is that it also is a way back into mythological, not just mythological imagination, because if I use the word imagination, I might accidentally seem like I'm discounting them, but mythological reality.
Right.
To speak personally, if I'm not, I want to live a mythical life.
Right.
A life which is bounded by statistics is incommensurate with that imperative. But modernity, as far as I can tell, and post-modernity, vis-a-vis its cynicism, is attempting to draw people out of that mythology. And in my view, that is to draw them out of reality. The mythic is the real. Okay, that's where I stand with it.
But that's there's so much to respond to. I have to say something before I forget everything I was going to make. But that's I completely agree here, because mythic space resonates with these deeply human aspects of our experience, of our psyches, of our souls, and so on. And to negate those is, in a sense, to close us off from these aspects of being. And I think this is truly a profound observation, which I cannot fully understand the implications of this, and I would like to dwell on this point for a bit, because I've thought about this, and I sense a lot of things here, but I can't really make sense of them in my normal way of thinking. But maybe that's also the problem. Maybe that's also inevitable. But also, in relation to what you said earlier on the violence inherent to the male condition, I think this is a valid point, and it brings to mind the way that the Robert Bly approaches the thing, and he juxtaposes fierceness with this pathological violence in a way that he opens up the discursive space for there being a sort of a positive aspect of male violence that can be channeled in certain ways, constructively, relationally, and so on. And this also brings to mind the fact that, in my personal experience, my way of relating to other men has been that of competition in a very unbalanced way, so that there has been a very limited lack of trust, a very limited sense of camaraderie and brotherhood, and mainly competition tinged with violence, fear, and hatred. And this arguably connects to the economic order and to the worldviews around us and all of that. But I think that's also something that many others experience, and to come to terms with that limited way of relating has been very fruitful for me personally in many ways. But so I would agree with you completely that mythological discourse is the only way you can approach, relate to, and reflect on certain fundamental realities of the world and of human condition. And to live in mythological reality is everyone, that's in a certain way, that's the human mode of being, and this has been the predominant form of thinking throughout probably hundreds of thousands of years. And if you go that route, it is evolved with us. It's something essential to being human and to human culture, and to sort of separate us from that, which has happened in maybe 150 years. It's probably devastating. It's probably extremely dangerous in a way. But let me make sense of this. What does mythological discourse mean, and why can't we relate to the levels of reality it unlocks with other modes of discourse, the formal rational discourse? I mean, Aquinas speaks of these things in very straightforwardly rationalistic terms, but maybe it's not fruitful in a sense. Maybe it doesn't go deep enough. Maybe it doesn't connect us. These abstractions do not properly connect us with these modes of reality. What would you say? We need ritual, we need myth to properly know this, right?
There's a few different moments or points here. I'll try and run through them. All right. The one is I'm going to make an audacious assertion. The audacious assertion is that we cannot help but live our life in mythic terms. We mean pretend otherwise.
Yeah.
But that is a conceit of the contemporary, right? So I'm just going to say that right now. And it just flows from my previous statement, which says that the mythical is actually the real. I'm going to bracket. I have some thoughts on competition. I'm going to come back to that in just a moment, right? But then, there's the two, before we come back to that, two further points. One being, what is there that is inadequate about rationalistic discourse, right? Well, I don't think it's necessarily inadequate for everybody, but it's kind of I think I'm kind of, to me, there's like a force to it that, but in this respect, apparently I'm a bit anomalous, okay? It becomes almost, this is perhaps, it's a question of how you relate to rational discourse. I think its adequacy may turn upon your relationship with honor. And if it's just a game to you, then it isn't going to be adequate, right? But if you take it seriously, then it will gain power in your life because of its capacity to demand integrity, right? If you take your ideas seriously, they have implications in terms of your decision. Now, what and honor there as a value is a point of contact with the mythical, okay? But it's not a necessary contact. If you don't have that contact, then it's hopelessly inauthentic.
Okay.
Hopelessly. Now, the issue of authenticity also arises with the challenge of ritual. The thing is that there's this desire, this quite understandable desire to, in this sort of like the challenge of the present age, to find new rituals. But
right.
As much as I want to participate in that process, there's almost a kind of sense of contrivance about it all. It's so contrived and I don't know how to move beyond that. It could be that if you just really do it, if you just exert yourself, after a while, that discipline will suddenly impart to what was originally arbitrary a greater reality than it had at its outset. That's certainly conceivable, but I don't want to place all my chips in that basket. I think that there needs to be a reconnection with tradition. very broadly speaking, right? It's nice to have your own stories, and we have our own stories, right? We have the story of the Jedi, okay, which sounds kind of, kind of like funny, haha, but it's actually a narrative which, the discipline of the Force can be traced historically to deeper,
Right.
longer lasting sorts of, traditions of warriorship and what have you, right? Um, but I don't have a solution. I'm just going to acknowledge that the challenge is authenticity, right? Then to sort of round it out, then to come back to the question of competition and modes of competition. Well, part of the problem is that because we've lost touch with a mythical relationship with competition, our orientation toward each other in competition has become more pathological.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And without the framing tools of myth or code, then
Yeah.
it really very easily devolves to just petty rivalry. I actually think competition is extraordinary, and games in general are extraordinarily useful as training for like one's own personal content, right? Like, so I play chess, it's part of my life, and I'll tell you what, nothing like chess has helped me confront and deal with my own anger, because there's nowhere to hide. Okay, there's nowhere to hide in chess. The mistakes are your own. It's there for everybody to see, right? And that's just an example. It's true of all competition. It can be very fruitful, but to draw that fruit, you have to situate what you're doing with this other person in a very, you're helping each other train, right? Iron sharpens like iron is sort of the tool, right? But the traditions of training they haven't been lost, but they've from our focus, right? And that may connect with the problem of not having a narrative, even a mythological narrative that grounds our relationship with it.
Right. I completely agree. And to reconnect with what I said earlier, I mean, the 1980s nostalgia that was predominant in Western popular culture for not exactly sure which years, and it's still here, but like 2013 to 17, 18 or something like that. I think it connected with this need of a mythical narrative, which arguably was present up until the end of the Cold War, the conflict between two empires, the before the end of history phase came to be, where there was still also this, this hope of utopia. So yeah, I also agree we need to reconnect with tradition, arguably just because tradition holds more accurate representations. Mythical tradition holds more accurate representations of these deep human realities. We can't just invent the wheel again when we're trying to and replace something that's been with us for millennia, like many millennia. And thinking through what you said, I think rationalist discourse, it's an effective set of tools, but it's a limited mode of knowing that tends to detach us from the realities known. So we need mythological discourse. We need the complex aesthetic experience and the ritual to truly connect our persons to these deeper realities, to truly know them in the relational sense and not just in the sense of the detached observer. That, I would argue, why mythical discourse, mythical space is needed to connect us properly with these realities. I think as opposed to what rationalist discourse can do. I think you can make that point.
I'm drawn to add one further suggestion, and this is simply that the engagement of silence will connect you to the mythic, whether you like it or not. Okay. Now you will encounter reality in silence that will explode, just explode your rationalism. And I don't want to make too much of it, right? But there's, you noted Aquinas and his prodigious and impressive efforts. But then what did he say at the end of his life, right?
Yeah.
He said famously that it was all straw.
Yeah.
He had a moment of encounter, right? So just to sit in one's own silence. But it's not easy. I suspect you know that as well. Probably maybe even better than I know it. But it's not easy. But I think also it's something that if we were to sort of move to do that more, that in itself would reconnect us with the ground of the real.
I don't think I can add much to this.
It seems like that might be a point from which we can, maybe adjourn, right? So what
this gives me, it gives me a lot of sort of follow-up questions to things I've been thinking about for years. So this has been a very fruitful discussion for me, I must say.
Well, mutually. So thank you very much, Johan.
Well, thanks so much, Tom.
I think
this has been great.
There, at least for the moment. And thank you all for listening. And we will catch you on the flip side here, as it were.
Thanks so much for this opportunity, Tom. I'll talk to you later.
Talk to you later. Bye.
Good night.